Hello, I'm Charles Eldermeyer, the project leader for the Cornell Labs bird cams, and I'm really excited to bring our viewers the opportunity this week to get a chance to have a conversation with three people who are closely involved in the California Condor Recovery Project. Sitting in the middle, we have Molly Astell, who's a wildlife biologist with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service at Hopper Mountain National Wildlife Refuge Complex. Erin Arnold is a biological science technician, also working with the Fish and Wildlife Service. And Dave Meyer is a condor biologist at the Santa Barbara Zoo. And you might wonder, hello everybody on that end, can you hear us okay?
Yep, we can hear you.
Great. So I thought it'd be a great, since we're going to be hearing from all three of you across the next hour or so, learning about condors and about the work that you're doing and answering our viewers' questions. I thought it'd be great to start out first with learning just a little bit about what each of you does and the role you play in the Condor Recovery Project. So maybe we'll start right in the middle with Molly. Could you give our viewers a sense of what you do for the Condor Project?
Sure thing. So I'm one of the wildlife biologists with the Fish and Wildlife Service, like you said. And I'm kind of in charge of helping the operations out in the field, the day-to-day work we do, monitoring condors and uh, watching the population. And so I kind of help lead those operations. And then I'm also the lead on getting these cameras out into the nest. That's another big thing that I do. So.
And that's something we do get a lot of questions about, so we'll be sure to circle back to that technical aspect as well as all the other biological questions that we have. How about you, Erin? Can you tell us a little about what you do?
Yeah, of course. I just recently joined the Fish and Wildlife Service. So I help out Molly in the field with the sort of day-to-day condor field activities. And prior to this, I actually worked for the Santa Barbara Zoo with Dave, and I was the condor nest biologist for the past 2 years.
Great. Yeah, and it's great that you now have a foot kind of in both worlds, both there at the Santa Barbara Zoo and in the Fish and Wildlife Service, which is, it's always fun to hear both sides of that, those roles in this project. And Dave, this is the first time we've had you on camera as well. What do you do there at the Santa Barbara Zoo?
Yeah, so I'm one of the Condor biologists on staff, part of the folks that track and monitor the Southern California condor population.
Great. So I thought this year it'd be fun to really dive into this Pole Canyon pear and this site because, in part, this was actually the one place that I had visited when I went out 5 or 6 years ago to help out with some of the initial setting up of the live streaming parts of the Condor Cam. And so I wondered, I'm not sure which of you has the best sense of what the history is with this pair or this site, but I wonder if you could sort of bring our viewers up to speed with what's known about these birds and that site.
Yeah, for sure. I'll give a little background about the pair. 262 is the male in this pair, and he is an 18-year-old bird. He actually is a cool bird. They're all cool. Like he's an interesting bird because he is actually our first viable egg laid since the reintroduction program started. So he was laid back in 2001. And he was also one of two eggs laid to a trio. So we had two females and a male that got together, laid two eggs, and he was one of them. His egg in particular was pulled into captivity just to ensure that proper incubation was occurring. And then he hatched in captivity and was released a year later back to the wild. 563 is a 9-year-old bird. She was laid in captivity and released in 2011. And they both have had one nesting attempt before this one, before they got together. 262 had one nest before in 2015, and he and his former mate successfully fledged their chick. Unfortunately, his former mate went missing in the wild and is presumed dead. And 563 also has had one previous nest that was also in the Pole Canyon territory with her former mate. So her former mate was 237, who nested in the Pole Canyon territory for many years. I think it was about 13 years. And unfortunately, he also went missing in the wild last year and is also presumed dead. But then that gave the opportunity for 262 and 563 to get together about a year ago. And this is their first nest together in the full canyon territory.
What a cool history, especially with that trio playing a role in. How often do those trios happen, where you have multiple eggs and three birds participating in a reproductive attempt?
Mm-hmm. Yes, as far as we know, in the Southern California flock, that was our one trio. I think Molly can maybe speak towards other trios.
Yeah, I know Big Star has had a couple of trios, and there's one out in Arizona as well. So it does happen. It's not very common, but it does happen.
Okay, yeah, that was the first I had really sort of heard that, and that's really neat. And you're obviously referring to them by their wing tag numbers, and we know that our on cam nestling just got a number 980, right? And that there was just a 4 month checkup done. So I wondered if one of you might be able to update us on anything that came out of that checkup, anything you learned during that checkup that sort of is ready to be shared at this point. And everybody always wants to know about the sex of the bird, and if we don't know it now, when are we going to find it out? So if you could speak a little bit to that end of things, since that just happened, it'd be great to share it with viewers now too.
Yeah, so we took a blood sample while we were in the nest, and we'll about find that about in a month or so. We'll determine what the sex of the chick is. It was looking very well. A good indicator of health of the chick is tail length growth. That was 6 inches, which is normal. That's good. The chick was 18 and a half pounds, which is on par for normal. So that was looking good.
That's great. And were there any materials found in the nest cavity or anything in the bird that worried you, or any indication of lead playing a role yet in its life that you learned on that checkup?
Yeah, so good question. So when we are in the nest, we check for what's known as microtrash, which are pieces of trash that are accidentally brought back to the nest by the parents, which can be bottle caps, glass. We don't know exactly why they bring it back. We think it's possibly that it's a calcium supplement, which would be good for the chick, but unfortunately, it can be something that can be harmful to the chick. So when we're in the nest, we use a sieve to go through the substrate of the nest. Put that on camera. Okay. And we sieve through it to see if there is any trash inside the nest. If there is, we document it and we remove it out of the nest, as well as with a metal detector. Oh, there we go, right there. And we see if there's any metal inside the nest, and we will remove it. Luckily, there wasn't any metal inside the chick, so yeah, the chick appears to be doing well.
Great. We had a couple viewers ask about whether or not you can tell males from females. Obviously, with the chick, it's taking a blood test to figure that out. But is there a way to tell adult males from females when you're viewing, if somebody were out there viewing a condor?
Yeah, I got it. No, unfortunately, no. You need a blood test to determine that.
Okay, that's sort of been definitely my take on trying to tell them apart. Sometimes I'm glad they have wing tags. It helps a lot. You mentioned that the chick weighed 18 something pounds, and if you were to compare that to like the size of the bird to like a common everyday object or thing, how big are we talking about this chick being? Because 18 pounds is sort of like, it's hard to sort of like put in a person's mind what that would be, or kind of how big a thing that would be.
That would be a few pounds less than a full adult male turkey, to put for one. Or how about this? A couple, 2 gallons of water. How about that?
Okay, yeah, that says it. And how much weight does a chick tend to be gaining at this stage of its life? So it's obviously, episodic with the adults bringing food back, but is there sort of a rate of mass gain that we should be expecting as it continues to grow?
Yeah, it's a pretty steady rate of growth. So they start off when they're just hatching from the eggs. It's about 300 grams, which is more or less about a half of a pound. And then, over this period up to where we are at 120 days, it's at 18.5 pounds. But it's like if you were to look at a graph, it's just kind of like slowly going up. But I always think it's super impressive just to think of like if you had a kid and it grew to adult size in like 6 months, that's insane. That's crazy amount of growth. Um,
It is. It really is. And it's something pretty crazy about all birds, typically how quickly they move from being inside an egg to being able to fly away. It's consistently amazing. We had someone on Facebook named Laura she asked about the Zion National Park or condor chick, or basically condor chicks in other places. Do they also get 4-month checkups and tagged at a similar time, or is the management of each of those populations differ substantially?
Yeah, there is definitely a difference between how the different sites manage the populations. And some of that is just due to like the different geographical locations. Like for us, it's, relatively easy for us to kind of walk us down the ridge and then set up an anchor, rappel down, get into the nest, and we can do that. That's something we can do. But for places like Zion or out in the Grand Canyon, that's a lot bigger task and there's a lot more risk involved. So it's a different type of challenge, it's just a different beast. So they tend to manage theirs differently. They kind of more have a hands-off approach. Um, Sometimes it's hard for them to even confirm for sure that they have a chick in there because it's just a lot more remote, challenging terrain out there.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And you touched on this, but we did get a couple of questions, including from someone who emailed us named Nancy, wondering how do you get high up on the cliffs at the canyon to conduct these checks and install the cameras, and who participates in those? Like, what does it take to actually do these health checks, and like, is it safe?
I'll take the first part of that. Yeah, so for the Pole Canyon nest entry in particular, it's quite an arduous hike down to get into the canyon itself, a couple hours. And then once you're actually at the top of the nest that you see from the cross canyon cam, it's about a 30-foot rappel to get into the nest. Actually, below the nest, it's about another 100-foot drop. So yeah, we're very safe when we do it. We take all the proper precautions. We make sure all our systems are redundant and backed up to make sure the rappel is safe. And then once we actually get into the nest, we process the chick through many different things, either saving, using a metal detector. We put a tag and transmitter on the chick. We take a blood sample for paternity as well as lead. Um, yeah. And then we give a general medical health checkup, and then we also vaccinate for West Nile virus. So.
And
It
then
sounds
as
like.
far as like
Go ahead. Sorry.
I was gonna say, as far as getting the cameras out there, that's kind of like a whole nother challenge of like, you can imagine trying to bushwhack. There's some of the spots on that hike are pretty dense. So trying to get a solar panel out there strapped to your back and then down the cliffside is challenging. I think I was definitely yelling and screaming when I was bringing one of the solar panels out. And then also like the batteries. I know I've had a battery pack with just the battery and water, and that's all I was taking, and it was like almost 100 pounds. So it gets heavy.
Well, that's a great time to sort of jump off into a couple of topics here. One is just to get a sense of from your eyes as people seeing these condors in real life. What you would tell viewers they're going to see over the next few weeks, and sort of jumping kind of back to this idea of cam installations. We do have this new cross canyon cam, which we're fading to back and forth from here. That's set up that you just set up not that long ago. So if you think about what we're going to see via the cavity cam in the nest cavity, but also this cross canyon cam, what should viewers expect to see over the next couple months?
So the chick will continue growing in its full flight feathers. So you can see that it's doing a good job there. The tail feathers will start to come in more. As far as the camera in the nest, you'll notice that the chick will be spending more and more time outside, which is why the across canyon camera is so great, so that we can continue to watch the chick as it starts to explore more. They like to scramble around. They'll start going up the cliff face, going down the cliff face a little bit as it gets closer and closer to fledging. And the across canyon camera will allow us to sort of keep an eye on the chick and see where it goes before it takes its first flight.
Yeah, we definitely were spoiled by getting a cross canyon view last year, and I think everybody's excited to watch where this condor goes. But it actually opens up a whole new world of worry for some of our viewers when they see the sort of locations that the chick manages to scramble into. So, one question we got was, are there conditions, or under what conditions do Condor project staff ever intervene in response to something they might see on, whether it's our camera or the other cameras that you have set up in other nest cavities? Because this is the only cross canyon cam, correct?
Yeah, this is the only cross canyon one that we have this year.
And so,
Um,
thinking about the nest cavity cams, are there what are sort of the thresholds at which you guys decide to intervene? Because people worry about these birds, as you might imagine.
Mhm.
Correct. So at this point in development of the chick is at day 133. So that means if we do go inside the nest, there's a good chance the chick could force fledge out of the nest. And like I mentioned before, it's a 100-foot drop to the canyon floor. So we really would only go in there in case the chick was very sick or injured, and we had no choice but to go in. We don't want to cause any unnecessary risks to the chick.
And the other thing, like I know sometimes when you're watching the camera, you get really nervous because the chick gets close to the edge, and then like as it starts to flange, you just like, oh my gosh, the chick is gonna fall. But just keep in mind that like for us, that would definitely be scary. But for this bird, this is like naturally how the process occurs. Like it takes some like a little bit of slide and then a little bit of farther hop flapping, and eventually it gets there.
Yeah, I kind of wish it was that easy for us to fly because it'd be pretty cool. um, and just a general thought, because people are watching this chick often next to its parents, and they can see how different the two birds look, adult versus nestling. And at what point does the condor chick, as it grows up, start to assume those beautiful colors that we associate with the adult birds?
Yeah, so the chick will start to get its adult coloring around 4 to 5 years old. And it'll start going through this transition phase where we kind of modeled with the black of its head as a chick and then going into the red of the adults. And then actually around 2 years old, the brown eyes that it currently has will start to change to red.
Yeah, it's really it's you guys did a great job with repositioning the camera after the checkup, because we've just gotten some amazing views of the adult and the chick kind of perched on the edge, basking in the sun, and we've really been able to see it with a new clarity, kind of some of that coloration. So it's been really, really fun to watch. Now, Molly, you touched a little bit on sort of the just logistics of getting heavy, unwieldy gear through the brush down to these sites to get things set up. And one question we had was, why go through all that work to put these cameras up? Because we've told people these aren't the only cameras. It's not just a live streaming operation that you guys do. And so they want to know kind of what are you learning from these cams, and what role do these cams really play, that it should take up so much of your time when you could be doing something else for condors.
I think there's a few things that we get out of it. So the one thing, I think just pulling up the number, we've had 21 cameras running for the nest, which is pretty decent since 2012 was our first one. And so there's a few things we learn out of it. Part of that is I know there's some research going on for behavior in condor, just kind of life history stuff, just monitoring what the condors do, how often are they fed, that sort of thing. Um, but more importantly, on the management side, it helps us kind of, as the program goes on, we don't want to be holding the hand of the condor, so to speak, forever. Like we want these condors to be nesting on their own with no help from us and just doing well. And so it's kind of like that little baby step back where we can still keep an eye on all these birds in the nest and make sure that they're doing good. And if something's wrong, we can see it right away. We can get in there to intervene and help out. But we can take that step back and see like, okay, if we do a little less management, is everything all right? Is everything going to be okay? So it's really a helpful tool for kind of evaluating how we're managing condors.
And in putting up a cross canyon cam last year, this year, I'm not clear if there are other sites where you've run this in past years, but are there any specific goals where having the cross canyon cam helps you learn something else in addition to sort of the material that you're the way that you're using the cavity cams for management as well?
Sure. I think one of the cool things, especially last year, that was our first Cross Canyon one, and we never really got to see kind of like the more or less 24/7 view of a chick fledging. Like, we can send somebody hike all the way out there and sit there and watch with the scope and binos, but they're not going to capture the whole thing. So it was really cool to see that process unfold just in its entirety. In its entirety. But yeah, otherwise it's just another tool to kind of help us save resources and be able to watch the chick. There's been times in the past where chicks have gone missing or they've been killed somehow by a predator. So this helps us, if this chick were to suddenly disappear, we have a camera on it and we can get some answers for what's happening and how should we kind of think about any potential problems that do come up and work that into managing the population.
It's a great answer. Is there anything else you wanted to tell us about cam setups that you think that the average cam viewer might not know, besides, like you said, yelling as you get sort of held up in the brush and your feet are, I just imagine your feet kind of scrabbling in the air and the solar panel kind of lifting you off the ground and that sort of thing.
Yeah, so I mean, just the setup itself is difficult, but also, it's inevitable. Something's going to go wrong, and you're going to have to troubleshoot it. And it's difficult to troubleshoot. You can go out there and you can be like, oh, we thought this year we're like maybe we're not getting enough power through the solar panels, so we hiked out the second solar panel. But that's like a day of prepping up a solar panel, and then you have to hike out there, get it set up, and then come back. And I think the hike back is about 3 hours or so, but it's pretty long. And so there you've done one thing, and then you have to wait because sometimes the camera works and sometimes it doesn't. And then at some point you're like, well, that wasn't the solution. Let's try something else. And so, another day or two goes by where you go down and you change something, you look at something else, and oh, it's not that. So it takes a while. If it was just in the office, it would be so much easier, but it's not.
Yeah, it's very similar, running cams in other places. I can tell you that, having set up cameras in plenty of remote places that I don't get to go back and visit, and when they do break, inevitably it's very difficult to get them fixed. So we, however, don't have any really cameras running off of solar, which is why I always feel like a sort of a third wheel when it comes to discussions about what's happening with why the camera's encountering issues. So I just always let you guys take care of it because you guys are the experts. And we really appreciate all the time you guys take trying to figure out, especially this year, what's been driving kind of the camera going offline. And for all of our viewers that have noticed, we are aware of it, and we're working on it very hard with Molly and the rest of the crew. But as she just explained, it's a pretty complex challenge sometimes, both from a technical standpoint, but also the logistics of it being difficult to get out there to actually work with the equipment. So we do really appreciate that. Thanks.
The other thing, like, you have to wait for the camera to go down to be able to troubleshoot it. Like, if it's working, I can't figure out what's wrong because it's working. So that's a whole other thing. So.
Yeah, and often that's not predictable, which is also a challenge. And by the way, I'm hearing you guys really well. We've gotten a couple of emails from viewers saying that Molly and Erin, sometimes they're having a harder time hearing you than they are Dave. So I'm betting your voices are bouncing around a little bit. So if you wouldn't mind leaning in a little when you answer, I think we'll continue to hear you just fine. So we've gotten a number of just general questions about condors from viewers, and I'm going to start working through a list of them. We'll just kind of see where this goes. Sylvia from Instagram wondered whether or not these condors, or condors in general, come back to the same nest cavity to breed in consecutive years, or do they even breed in consecutive years?
Yeah, so they potentially can. Normally, what condors do is they'll breed every other year. The parents will continue to care for the chick for about a year after it fledges. So it sort of forces them into a every other year pattern. But it's certainly not unheard of for them to breed every year. And they certainly can use the same caves breeding season after breeding season. They'll sort of have a group of caves in their territory that they might cycle through. Or they can find a new cave in their territory that they like. For example, this cave that the 262 and 563 are in this year was actually used back in 2008 by a different pair. So depending on what birds are in the area and the territory that they're using, they can definitely recycle those caves year after year.
And while you did give us the history, Erin, of these particular birds and that they both were mated, or that this is their first time together, right, working on a nest, there was a question about whether or not parents stay mates for life, typically, like some other big bird species, for example, albatross, or do they tend? How often do they tend to switch to a new mate?
So yeah, they'll mate for life. As long as it makes sense, kind of thing. So there's definitely breakups and shakeups and things that'll switch the pairs around. More often than not, unfortunately, the reality is one of the birds in the pair will die, and so you're sort of forced into finding a new mate. But yeah, the birds will stay together for long periods of time. We had a pair that was together for about 13 years before one of them unfortunately passed away. So yeah, they'll mate for life, and sort of what one of our colleagues likes to say, like humans do, there will definitely be breakups or divorces. But yeah, and generally they'll stick together as long as it's working for both of them.
That makes sense. And sort of sticking on this idea of the adults working together, we had a couple questions about whether both parents do the same amount of work in Condor in raising young. So does the male spend as much time foraging or with the chick or everything as the female does? We got a question from both Facebook and from another social media source, and so people were really interested in, like, I only seem to see mom there, and it might just be when they're viewing, or so they wondered whether or not you might be able to help them understand whether or not there's an equal division of labor basically in Condor relationships.
Yeah, for sure. So parents will share duties equally. So they sort of switch on and off, especially when the chick is younger and they're doing incubating or brooding. They'll sort of switch on and off every 3 to 5 days. One parent will stick with the chick or the egg. The other parent will be off foraging and gathering food. But yeah, so for the most part, parenting duties are more or less equal. This definitely varies by the bird or the pair. But more often than not, it's about equal. I think anecdotally, people have seen or think they see that the males like to stick with the chicks more often. But again, generally across the board, it's an equal parental investment by both the male and the female.
And then you've also mentioned about some of these birds sticking together for up to 13 years, and also the fact these birds are long-lived animals. And we had a question from email, someone asking whether or not condors recognized each other after they're adults and maybe haven't even seen each other in a few years. And I wondered if you guys had any either anecdotal or actual data that seemed to speak to whether or not they do recognize each other or have relationships that might span sort of time apart.
Right. Well, they certainly recognize each other. As to how they recognize each other, we don't really know. As for anecdotal stories, I'm not sure. I don't know if you guys.
It's just hard to get into the mind of a condor.
Yeah.
Like I know we had one adult female, 79, who had been out in the wild for years and years, and she had several nests. She's on our first nest camera. But anyway, she ended up being taken into captivity for an eye issue, and she was in there for, I think it was 3 years or so. And then after a year, we're like, oh, okay, she had cataract surgery and she was doing good, so we decided to re-release her. And we had her in the flight pen for a while just to make sure everything was okay. And she was also acting as a mentor to our pre-release birds. But I think there was a lot of us just kind of wondering, like, okay, all these other birds are outside. Like, do they know it's her? Or they're like, oh, 79's back. Or like, I don't know. You can't get into the mind of a bird, but sometimes it's fun to speculate.
Well, we did have a question from someone that just sort of wondered from a qualitative standpoint, as some of really the only people to physically interact with these birds or to observe them for long, long periods of times. Like, you talked a couple times there about getting into the mind of a condor. Given your guys' close relationship to condors, how would you describe them as animals. As you know, people wonder if they're smart, are they crafty, are they, and obviously there's variation. But you know, if you had to say some words to describe your thoughts on what the personality of condors are, what are some of the things that come to mind for you, either personally or just even professionally for that matter, on what makes a condor?
They definitely have different personalities going from bird to bird. Like you can, a lot of us are familiar with the bird 216, and like as soon as you think of that bird, she's just like top dog. She chases everyone out of her territory, or even not her territory. Um, so some of them definitely kind of have that urge to be top dog, and that drives what they do. There are also some birds who they're kind of stay to the sideline. I know there was one bird we had in for lead for about a year, and then kind of like 79, we had that bird in the flight pen for a while, acting as a mentor bird with some of the birds who were going to be released into the wild for the first time. And it's kind of interesting to see. I think it was the first time I saw this. Maybe others have seen it too. But that mentor bird, like, it could have just gotten up, flown out, found its own food, been like, "See you guys, I'm done." But it saw the other birds that were in the flight pen with it. That were kind of struggling to like find food and figure out where do they go roost, what do they do with themselves. So you'd see it would like go up to the roost spot and then wait for the others to follow, and then they wouldn't really follow, so we'd come back to them and then try it again a few times. And then we also saw that bird actually feed some of those new released chicks, which is pretty unusual because it's not that chick's parents, or I shouldn't say chick, it's a younger bird.
Wow, that is really interesting. It's nice. I can see on the live canyon view right now. I think it's the youngster just stretched. Yeah, he's hopping around there on the ledge. Um, so speaking of food, one viewer named Penny wondered how hard is it for them to actually find food, and sort of what are the main sources of food? Where are these birds finding the food? What are they eating that they're providing back to their young? And is there a lot of competition for that food from other vultures or other animals?
Right. So condors are obligate scavengers, so that means they just eat dead things. As for how good of scavengers they are, pretty darn. Um, yeah. So they get most of their food right now, anyway, from the southern Sierra, northern Tehachapi region. And actually, the dad at this nest, 262, was just seen feeding on a cow just north of the town of Tehachapi a couple of days ago. So if you ask where they're getting their food, that's a lot of it up around that area. A lot of cattle operation. They also eat elk, deer, rabbit, pretty much anything that's dead.
I had another question about food here, but I was just sort of like drawn into your answer. I was thinking about them flying around eating elk, and also on the coast, right? I've read that condors that live along the coast are also finding some interesting food from the sea. Is that right? Things like sea lions and whales and things, right?
Yeah, so their population has a chance to a whole different diet because of the areas that they inhabit. And I can remember hearing a story about how there was a beached whale that the condors were feeding on for a while. And at the time, they were doing nest entries up there. And so they went in to check on this chick who had been fed whale basically by its parents back and forth. And it was just like a big, greasy ball of a bird. Um, so that's kind of funny.
That's what I'd be like too. So these wing tags that you guys put on, there's the ability to track the birds, right, via radio frequencies and GPS. And some people wondered whether or not condors actually do they have migrations or seasonal movements that are a part of their natural history there in Southern California, or are they generally on territory year round?
Right. It's not migration in the typical sense. Like they don't fly down to South America, say, every year, but they do have seasonal migration patterns within their territory. So as to how we track them, one way, like you mentioned, is GPS, and this is called a solar powered GPS unit, which they wear on their wing tag, and it allows us to see their day-to-day movement patterns. As to where they fly in their range, it's over 1,800 square miles, I believe, is the Condor range in Southern California. So pretty large area. and they fly upwards of what we think upwards of 200 miles a day or more.
Wow, that's an impressive amount of movement. And you know, the we've learned a little bit in past years about some of the threats that could threaten condors, whether it's fire, whether it's lead, which we'll talk about, I think, a little bit more later. But we had a couple questions about whether or not they have predators of them. Does anything prey on condors? And do they have defensive behaviors that they use when they are threatened by something?
Yeah, so predation is not usually like the major killer of condors, but there are sometimes issues with predators. I know we've lost a few to golden eagles, both chicks and adults. There was a mountain lion that took a couple condors, as well as a bobcat, and we suspect that a bear also might have taken a chick. So there are some predators out there that will eat a condor, but by the large killer is definitely lead. That's about 50% of the known mortalities that we have are lead caused.
And sort of sticking on this idea of survival, we had a question come in about basically the mortality rate of condor chicks and wondering how many wild-born chicks make it to adulthood versus captive reared chicks, and sort of the long-term prognosis for wild-born versus captive reared chicks. So just sort of getting an idea for around survival and whether or not there's any difference.
Mhm. Yeah, so before the nest guarding program started, survival rate of wild chicks was at about 6 to 12%. And then after the nest guarding program started, so the nest entries and nest observations, we picked it back up to about 53%, which is where we are at currently than what it was historically before the reintroduction program. So we're at about 53% survival rate for chicks in the wild.
And then the other thing to kind of consider is, for these chicks, like even before hatch, they're facing a lot of challenges out there. Even the egg itself could be predated by ravens. So getting to that stage of being hatched, that's a challenge. And then as you're growing up in the nest, you have issues with, micro trash is taking chicks, possibly predators, although luckily that's not too common. And potentially, it's possible there could be a disease that kills them at that stage or something else. So there's all these threats before you've even gotten to the point of fledging. And then once you fledge, there's a whole other set of challenges just to get to like up to 2 years. And for the captive bred birds, they don't get released into the wild until they're about a year and a half old. So they have that first year and a half where they're in a safe place with trained people who can provide any medical assistance they need, and they get fresh, clean food source, no micro trash. So they really kind of have a leg up on the wild birds. But that said, once they get released into the wild, all the ones that were raised in the wild are like, oh, I got this. I've been flying around for a while. And the new release chicks just don't know what to do. For like the first 2 weeks, they have no clue. Sometimes they just stay on the ground for a couple of days. So that's where, maybe it's not so easy to be a captive bred chick. But after they kind of get past that 2 year mark of being 2 years old, pretty much all of the condors have the same chance of survival after that.
Well, that's a huge increase, all the way up to 53% after the nest guarding. It's really impressive. It's really great to hear that. Every year, I'm amazed. I was really excited when we started this project because back in the 80s and 90s, like California condors were like this totemic endangered species that really crystallized a whole movement in a lot of ways, asked a lot of hard questions and ethics about how to try and care for a severely endangered species, right? And it's great to hear how well they're doing now. And so we have a few questions about sort of the general condor conservation in numbers now. So like if you take all the people that you know of working on condor conservation, and compare that to the number of birds there are actually extant in the entire population of California condors, what would those numbers be like? Would they be similar? You think one's bigger than another?
That's a good question. I think it's kind of hard to tell like how many people are contributing towards the condor's recovery because, so, I mean, sometimes people, maybe it's not their full-time job, but they're doing something that is definitely helping us out. Sometimes it's really obvious, like we're out there on the ground, like of course we're working with condors, but we have a lot of people who are doing research that goes into helping us, manage in the best way possible and find out what's going on with condors and what we need to be focusing on. Um, I'd say overall, there's probably more people working for the recovery than there are condors. And also keeping in mind that, a lot of times when we're talking here, we're talking about the Southern California population. So, like, if we're giving out our numbers and our nest stats and everything, that's just Southern California. But there's Big Sur, there's Baja, Mexico, there's the population out in Arizona. So it's a big program with a lot of people.
And how many condors are there now, sort of extant across all those populations added together? Do you guys have an idea of what that number is, and how many of those are also in captivity?
Yeah, so every year in January, we kind of like step back, take a look, count all the birds. So these numbers are from this past January, the start of 2019. But at that time, we had 488 condors in the whole world, 312 of which were in the wild, which is so great. And then we had another 176 in captivity, and those birds are also super important to the program, kind of going into that whole captive breeding thing and producing those young birds that we can then release out into the wild and increase those numbers.
Well, we did have a question about how people know a little bit about inbreeding, bottlenecks, that sort of thing, and given the size and importance of the captive population to the ongoing success of the project, could you give just a little taste of what goes into managing kind of the genetics of that captive population? Like, how do you guys even do that?
Sure. So yeah, I mean, when you get down to 22 birds, that's definitely a challenge to kind of make sure you are keeping diverse genetics in the population. So when they had first brought in all those birds back in the 70s, or sorry, the 80s, 87, um, then they kind of took a look at the DNA of the birds and they found out at the time they thought there were 14 founder birds, so kind of like family lines that the birds could come from. But then they, really took a closer look and looked at the genome of the birds and they found out, oh, there's actually two of those were pretty related. So there were 13 founder birds. And since they kind of knew the genetics of the birds, they could make pairs appropriately and be like, oh, this is kind of an underrepresented family, so we're going to try to, that's a valuable bird genetically speaking, so we're going to make sure that one's one of the breeders. Um, and maybe this bird, its genetics are, it's pretty well represented, so we can take that one out to the wild and keep going with the wild population. But yeah, and I know there's other considerations too. I personally am on the field side, obviously, but in talking with some of the folks who work with the captive pairs, there's always challenges with like, is this bird going to want to mate up with this bird, or is it like not the best match for them? So there's other things to take into consideration.
So you'd probably say that a lot's known about the diversity of the birds that you have, but there's still some skill to being a matchmaker for these birds in captivity, right? There's still a need for someone that has that as a skill. It's not just the science, really, at this point, which is kind of cool. It goes back to your idea that there's different personalities, just like in people, right? Um, we have a couple questions. One coming in from Instagram about the identification tags that are put on, and one thing that people see them and they look really bulky to them, and there's the question of like, well, doesn't this interfere with their molt? How do you guys put it on there in such a way that it's not deleterious to the bird? What's it made out of? And so, would you mind filling our viewers in on a little bit more about the wing tags?
Yeah, sure. So each condor in the world has their own individual number, what we call a stub book number, and that's usually from right now it's one to I think we're a little over 1,000 right now. So when they're out in the wild, for us to identify them, we use wing tag. So every single, at least in our population, the southern population, every single color represents 100 series. So in this case, the white would represent Condor 400 to Condor 499. In this case, it's 57. So this would be Condor 457. Um, Yeah, and then also green.
Prettier colors.
There you go. Green. So this would be Condor 712. As for if they're troublesome when the condor flies, we don't have any data that would indicate that it would be harmful to their flight. These are massive birds we're talking about. Yeah.
And then they don't seem to interfere with feathers growing in or anything as they replace their primaries or anything like that? Great.
No, not that we know.
Um, so a couple of sort of big questions. We got about 10 minutes left here, and I just want to remind everybody we're talking with Molly and Erin from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and Dave from the Santa Barbara Zoo right now. One question that came in via email is sort of, I'm not sure exactly what your answer to this is going to be, but it's a pretty broad one. How close is the recovery program to achieving its goal? And I would say that I don't actually know what that goal is, and there might be lots of different goals. And so given the broadness of it, I don't know where you want to start with that, but what is the recovery program trying to do, and how close are you to getting it done?
Sure. I mean, I think that's a tough question even from the start. When we first started to notice that condors were in the decline, like the fact that they were in decline means we don't have like a super great idea of what was a healthy condor population historically. So we're already kind of having to imagine what would that be just straight from the start. And so when the recovery program was put together, there's kind of a lot of discussions of what is a healthy condor population. And I think at the time it was specified, okay, let's say a population with at least 100 or two populations with at least 150 birds and 15 breeding pairs. And so at the time, that was kind of like, all right, we got to find a target. That's going to be our target. But even now, I think if you get folks together, they'll kind of talk and be like, okay, but is that really a recovered population, or is it more? Or, it's hard to find what exactly is a recovered population.
And I think that makes sense. You sum it up well in saying it's hard to know what the baseline was before, anything before the recovery started. Really, the populations were so small, and given that sort of uncertainty about some of the baseline information, is there a sense of whether or not there's enough habitat left to even support a growing wild population of condors?
Yeah, absolutely. There's certainly no shortage of food. Monitoring their GPS movements, condors inhabit in a massive territory. So our main operations are based in Southern California around Bitter Creek National Wildlife Refuge and Hopper Mountain National Wildlife Refuge. But birds fly all the way up on the Southern Sierra. I think the farthest north flight this year was actually to the Southern Yosemite border, which is a massive amount of area that they could find food and or nest, or that's a massive area to forage. So,
Wow.
as
And
yeah,
and and
as
ge-
more
sorry.
birds are enough, then yeah, there's more than enough territory for them to inhabit.
And given that northward expansion, are there also plans to release condors in other areas like Northern California or Oregon?
There are discussions that folks are having right now about having a release site up in Northern California. We're not like completely finalized in how things are going to happen or anything, but yeah, there is a group of folks working towards that.
That's a really exciting thing to consider as well. You'd mentioned earlier, as far as mortality in condors goes, that lead is the number one leading sort of single thing that's killing condors. And there's been lots of efforts to remove lead from the condors range and ongoing efforts, right, especially in California. And someone asked, how long after California completely bans lead, which is there's some period of time before that even probably happens. Do you think condors will stop finding carcasses with lead in them? Or how long do you think from there being some legal solution to having lead really decrease in importance as far as the survival? Do you have a sense of how quickly that might come about?
Sure. I don't think any of us knows like how quickly the change is going to happen. But it's definitely an issue of education and outreach. Just having a law banning lead isn't necessarily just definitely okay, we're done, we're good. You got to get out there and talk with folks and make sure everybody's educated on things. And also, the legal solution isn't the only solution. Out in Arizona, they've done an amazing job working with hunters, kind of working on getting that non-lead message out. And that's a whole other way to do it, and they've been really successful with that, and I think that's great, getting out there and working with folks. But yeah, I mean, the main thing, one of the messages that we have is, hunting is definitely, it's not the problem. In fact, it's part of the solution. If a hunter goes out, kills a deer, gets some food for his family, and then has that gut pile out there for the condor, that's great. That's awesome for everybody. But it's just getting that contaminant out of that activity. So just getting the lead out.
Well, we can all sort of keep our fingers crossed and keep working to spread that message and interact with people and learn more about ways to make that relevant to people, so that it can continue to be a positive source of change for the condors. We got a couple questions like this one that we got from Instagram. We've got about 5 minutes left here. And it sort of captures kind of, we see you guys working so hard and on really the front lines of condor conservation. But there's also this feeling, well, what can we do? Those of us, I mean, some of us don't even live in California. Hard to believe, right? With the traffic. So what can an average person do to help condors flourish? And what are some other ways that we can all work together to increase the likelihood of this continued recovery just continuing to grow?
Sure. I mean, I think for the folks in the condors area, like helping with picking up trash, so we don't have micro trash. That's an easy one if you happen to be in the area. But also kind of spreading that message of getting the lead out of the environment, not only for condors, but lead isn't good for anything. It's not good for humans or any other animal. And condors aren't the only species affected by it. So kind of spreading that word, and then also just supporting the organizations that are out there doing this work or helping us do the work. I think that's definitely a big help.
That's great points. If somebody wanted to see a California condor, are there condors at the Santa Barbara Zoo? Are there other places where they might reliably see a wild condor that you guys might advise them if somebody's headed that way?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's 4 condors at the Santa Barbara Zoo. Highly recommended. You all should go. But out in the wild, in our population anyway, there's a few hot spots where you can see them. So Bitter Creek National Wildlife Refuge is the spot where that we release captive red condors in our population. There are roads near that area that there's a good chance you can spot condors. It's pretty amazing. Lake Piru area, a few other spots up in the Southern Sierra, like in the Tehachapi area. There's also many. And then for Central California, you have all along the Big Sur coast, and then Pinnacles National Park also has many condors as well. And then, of course, our friends over at the Peregrine Fund in Arizona, Vermilion Cliffs area is an amazing spot to go.
Great. Well, we're just about at the end of this hour. Are there other sources of information beyond the live cam that you guys would like to share with our audience about sort of learning more about condors? We know kind of where we might want to go see condors. Are there places or online sites or things that they might do with school classrooms or anything that you guys are familiar with that's a part of the recovery project, just not something we'd see on camera?
I mean, I know we have like the Condor Cave Facebook page where we share a lot of clips and stories about the adults and the chicks in the Southern California population. But also, just because you haven't mentioned, I think outreach and kind of teaching, we do have a Condor Kids program that teachers can download and integrate into their classroom, which I think is super awesome. Giving kids a chance to learn about condors and conservation. So yeah, maybe we can dig up that link for folks.
Great. Well, I really appreciate you guys spending the time to talk with us today. I know I learned a lot during this hour. Every year we get a chance to talk, I learned something new about the condors. And it's really through you guys spending the time to get together, cram into the view of a single webcam on a computer so that we can see your smiles and hear what you're saying. And it's a great way to reinforce the hard work that you guys are doing, and also the fun that I get to have in partnering with the Santa Barbara Zoo and the Fish and Wildlife Service to help bring this camera to life. So thank you guys again. I hope you have a really great day. I'll warn the crowd that is watching online, the cavity camera did go offline during this broadcast. So I'm going to be switching the feed back over to the cavity cam. It will, when it comes online, restore itself. But till then, you'll notice that the image is frozen. It's a nice silhouetted shot of the nestling. But apologize for that. We're still working on it. And as you learned earlier, it's always a work in progress when it comes to technology in the wilderness. So thanks for your understanding. And thank you, Erin, Molly, Dave, for showing up today and sharing all your thoughts with us.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for all your support.
All right, well, take care, and we'll talk to you again soon. All right, bye-bye.
Bye.